"Let me touch you there," the lowly cowboy asked. The giant Apache woman smiled back. Blood painted the Arizona desert crimson as Gideon Nash crawled through cactus thorns, his surveyor's maps scattered like fallen prayers. Above him, Captain Reynolds's cavalry circled like vultures, hunting the Apache warrior woman who'd just shattered his brother's skull with her bare hands. In the distance, war drums echoed off canyon walls, while railroad barons in distant cities counted profits from land soaked in native blood. This is the story of two souls caught between worlds, a story of maps that could save nations or destroy them, of a love forged in gunfire, and of the choice between survival and honor. Stay with me until the end and comment which city you're watching from, so I can see how far this tale has traveled across the world. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the Arizona territory in the summer of 1885, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked earth where wagon wheels had carved their final tracks. Gideon Nash pressed his face against the rocky outcropping, tasting copper and dust, as he watched the last of the massacre unfold below him. The Butterfield stage had been carrying more than passengers and mail. Hidden beneath false floorboards lay his carefully drawn maps, precise surveys of railroad routes that would punch through Apache lands like iron fists. Now those maps scattered in the desert wind, while Comancheros and white renegades picked through the wreckage like carrion birds. "Please," whispered Sarah Whitman, the Reverend's daughter who'd somehow survived the initial assault. Blood matted her blonde hair as she clutched Gideon's arm. "They're coming back." Gideon's weathered hands shook as he checked his Winchester. 23 years old, barely 5'6", he'd spent more time with compass and transit than with weapons. The Kansas Pacific Railroad Company had sent him west to map the future, not to die in some god-forsaken gulch. "Stay quiet," he hissed, though his voice cracked with fear. Below them, a massive figure emerged from the smoke and chaos. The man stood nearly 7 feet tall, his face painted with white clay and red ochre in patterns that seemed to shift in the heat shimmer. Crow Dog, the Apache who'd turned against his own people for Spanish gold. Behind him rode a mixed band of renegades, white men fleeing justice, Mexican bandits, and Apache warriors who'd chosen gold over honor. "Mira aquí," one of the Mexicans called out, holding up Gideon's leather map case. "Maps of the Iron Horse trails." Crow Dog's scarred face split into a grin that revealed teeth filed to points. "The railroad men pay much silver for these papers, and more silver still for the mapmaker who drew them." Sarah's fingernails dug into Gideon's forearm. They'd been spotted. A young Comanchero with a braided beard pointed directly at their hiding place. "There behind the rocks." The sound of boots and hooves thundered across the hardpan as the raiders charged up the slope. Gideon rose to his knees, levering his rifle, but his hands trembled so violently he couldn't draw a proper bead. The first shot shattered rock 6 inches from his head. The second punched through his left shoulder, spinning him around in a spray of blood. Sarah screamed as raiders crested the ridge like demons from hell. "Take the woman alive," Crow Dog roared in accented English. "She brings good price in Sonora." That's when the earth seemed to shake. At first Gideon thought it was thunder, but the sky burned clear and merciless blue. Then he saw her. She came over the eastern ridge like a force of nature, mounted on a black stallion that seemed to fly across the broken ground. Even at distance, her size was unmistakable. She stood taller than any woman Gideon had ever seen, broader through the shoulders than most men, her long black hair streaming behind her like a war banner. "Dios mío," breathed the Mexican bandit. "It's her. It's Aiyana." The Apache warrior woman who'd earned a price on her head, larger than any outlaw in the territory. 3 cavalry companies hunted her. Bounty hunters told stories around campfires about her impossible strength, her uncanny ability to appear and disappear like smoke. Some claimed she could break a man's neck with her bare hands. Others whispered she was a witch who could call lightning from clear skies. All of those stories, Gideon realized as she thundered closer, had been conservative. Aiyana rode, with no saddle, her powerful legs gripping the stallion's flanks, as she guided him with nothing but pressure and will. She wore traditional Apache clothing, buckskin dress decorated with turquoise and silver high moccasins that reached her knees, but she carried weapons from 3 worlds. A cavalry saber hung at her left hip, a Colt revolver rode her right. Across her back she bore both a traditional Apache bow and a Spencer repeating rifle. The raiders below scrambled for positions, but they moved like children compared to her fluid grace. She was among them before most could level their weapons. The first man she killed barely had time to scream. Her stallion trampled him into the dirt while her saber took the head clean off a second. The blade sang through the air, droplets of blood catching sunlight like rubies. "Spread out," Crow Dog bellowed. "Circle her." But Aiyana moved like water flowing between their attacks with impossible speed. A Comanchero fired his pistol point blank at her chest. Somehow the bullet sparked off a silver ornament on her dress, without breaking skin. Her return stroke opened him from sternum to spine. Gideon watched in fascinated horror as she dismounted in one fluid motion, using her horse as a shield, while she drew her rifle. The Spencer cracked like thunder, and a Mexican bandit cartwheeled backward off his mount. She worked the lever without seeming to aim and fired again. Another raider screamed and clutched his shattered arm. "She's just one woman," Crow Dog roared, but his voice carried less certainty now. "Kill her!" 5 men rushed her position. Aiyana waited until they were almost upon her before moving. She rolled left, came up firing, and put 2 rounds center mass into the closest attacker. The Spencer's magazine ran dry, so she transitioned to her Colt with practiced ease, but there were too many of them. As she fought, more raiders appeared on the ridge, a dozen hard men with blood in their eyes and nothing to lose. Even someone with her skills couldn't fight them all. That's when Gideon Nash made the decision that would change everything. He didn't think. If he'd thought, he would have stayed hidden, let the raiders kill the Apache woman, and prayed they'd be satisfied with her death. Instead, he rose from behind his rocky shelter, Winchester at his shoulder, and began firing as fast as he could, work the lever. His first shot took a raider in the leg. His second missed entirely, but the distraction was enough. Aiyana spun toward this new gunfire, saw him silhouetted against the sky, and for one impossible moment their eyes met across the chaos. She had the darkest eyes he'd ever seen, not brown but true black, like looking into deep water at midnight. In that instant something passed between them, not understanding exactly but recognition. 2 people caught between worlds, fighting for survival against impossible odds. "Behind you!" Gideon shouted. Aiyana whirled just as Crow Dog lunged at her with a wickedly curved knife. She caught his wrist in her left hand, and Gideon heard bones crack even over the gunfire. The 7-foot Apache screamed and dropped his blade. "You forget your people's ways, Crow Dog," she said in perfect English, her voice carrying despite the chaos. "You hunt with wolves, you die like one." She drove her knee into his solar plexus, doubling him over, then brought both fists down on the back of his neck. The giant collapsed like a felled tree. The remaining raiders broke and ran. Silence settled over the battlefield like dust after a windstorm. Bodies lay scattered across the hard-pan blood, already beginning to congeal in the desert heat. Gideon's shoulder throbbed, but he managed to keep his rifle steady as Aiyana approached. Up close, she was even more imposing. She stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broader than his own, and arms corded with muscle that spoke of years wielding weapons and working with horses. But her face was beautiful in a way that made his chest tight. High cheekbones, full lips, those midnight eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "You shoot well for a mapmaker," she said, stopping just outside sword range. "How do you know what I—" She gestured at the scattered papers. "Your maps. I have seen them before. You can read them. Something that might have been amusement flickered across her features. I attended the Indian school in Carlisle for 3 years before I escaped. Kill the Indian, save the man, isn't that how your people put it? They taught me to read your language, your numbers, your maps. They wanted to make me white. She touched the silver and turquoise ornaments on her dress. It did not take. Sarah Whitman moaned behind them, and Aiyana's attention shifted to the injured woman. Without hesitation, she knelt beside Sarah and began examining her wounds with surprisingly gentle hands. Bullet grazed her scalp, Aiyana announced. Knocked unconscious, but she will live. Why are you helping us? Gideon asked. Your people and mine. My people. Aiyana's laugh held no humor. Look around you, mapmaker. Which of these men were my people? She gestured at Crow Dog's unconscious form. He sells Apache women and children to Mexican slavers, trades our sacred places to your railroad for whiskey money. Her voice hardened. I have no people anymore, only enemies wearing different faces. Gideon realized he was still bleeding. The bullet had torn through the meat of his shoulder, missing bone, but leaving him weak and shaky. I need to get Miss Whitman to a doctor. Nearest town is Tucson, 3 days' ride. Aiyana stood, seeming to tower over him like some ancient goddess of war. You will not live that long. Why not? Because you are carrying railroad maps through Apache lands during war season. Because Captain Reynolds and his cavalry are hunting me and they will follow my trail here. Because your friend Crow Dog has many brothers who will want revenge. She studied his pale face. And because you are bleeding like a stuck pig. As if summoned by her words, dust appeared on the northern horizon, riders moving fast. Reynolds, Aiyana said simply, how can you tell from this distance? The way they ride, cavalry formation. Your captain has been chasing me for 6 months, ever since I killed his brother at Apache Pass. Gideon felt ice in his veins despite the desert heat. Captain Wallace Reynolds commanded Fort Huachuca's most experienced Indian fighters. If he caught them here with Aiyana, they'll hang you, he said, if they catch me. She moved to her stallion and swung into position with fluid grace. Good luck, mapmaker. Wait. She paused, one eyebrow raised. Take me with you. Aiyana stared at him as if he'd announced his intention to sprout wings and fly. You would slow me down, and your woman needs a doctor. She's not my woman. I barely know her. Gideon struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. And those maps, they're not just railroad surveys. They show water sources, hidden passes, places your people could hide from the cavalry. Her dark eyes narrowed. What do you want, white man? To stay alive. To understand why Crow Dog wanted my maps badly enough to slaughter a whole wagon train. He met her gaze steadily. To know why an Apache woman speaks better English than half the men in my survey crew. For a long moment she studied him. The dust cloud grew closer. You know they call me a renegade, she said finally. I've heard the stories. Most of them are true. I don't care. Something shifted in her expression, surprise perhaps, or calculation. If you ride with me, there is no going back. Reynolds will hunt you as he hunts me. Your own people will call you traitor. My own people sent me out here to map territory for a railroad that will destroy Apache water sources and sacred grounds, Gideon said. Maybe it's time I chose a different side. Aiyana considered this. In the distance, they could hear the thunder of approaching hooves. Can you ride wounded? I'll have to. She gestured toward a paint mare that had belonged to one of the dead raiders. That horse will carry you, but if you fall behind, you'll leave me for the buzzards. I understand. No, she said quietly. I will put a bullet in your head, so Reynolds cannot question you about where I have gone. Gideon climbed onto the paint mare, biting back a groan as the movement sent fire through his wounded shoulder. What about Miss Whitman? Aiyana was already moving, collecting scattered maps and stuffing them into her saddlebags. Reynolds will find her. He is not a bad man, only driven by grief and duty. He will see she gets help. And Crow Dog will wake with broken ribs and a skull that feels like it's splitting, but he will live to hunt us another day." She swung onto her stallion. "Ready." Gideon nodded, though he felt anything but ready. The cavalry dust cloud was perhaps 15 minutes away. They rode hard toward the eastern mountains, Aiyana setting a pace that made Gideon's teeth rattle and his shoulders scream with every stride. Behind them, Sarah Whitman lay unconscious among the dead, while Crow Dog slowly stirred to consciousness. As they climbed into the foothills, Gideon risked a look back. He could see the cavalry, now blue-coated figures riding in perfect formation under Captain Reynolds's command. They would find the massacre site 10 to Sarah and begin following the trail that led deeper into Apache country. "Where are we going?" he called to Aiyana. "Somewhere your maps cannot follow," she replied without turning around. They rode through landscapes that belonged in fever dreams, red rock formations twisted into impossible shapes, hidden valleys where ancient peoples had painted their stories on canyon walls, springs that bubbled up from underground rivers older than civilization. Aiyana moved through this country like she'd been born to it, reading signs in broken twigs and scattered stones that were invisible to Gideon's surveyor-trained eyes. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, she finally called a halt beside a small spring hidden among towering saguaro cacti. "We camp here tonight," she announced, dismounting with fluid grace. Gideon practically fell off his horse. His shoulder had stopped bleeding, but the wound throbbed with every heartbeat. Aiyana studied him with those dark eyes, then moved to her saddlebags. "Remove your shirt." "What? Your wound needs cleaning or it will fester and kill you." She produced a bottle of clear liquid that smelled like distilled lightning. "Unless you prefer to die slowly." Gideon struggled out of his blood-stained shirt, hissing as the fabric pulled at his wound. Aiyana poured water from her canteen over the injury, washing away dried blood and desert grit. Then she uncorked the bottle. "This will hurt," she warned. The alcohol hit his raw flesh like liquid fire. Gideon bit down on a scream, his vision going white around the edges. When the pain subsided enough for him to see clearly, Aiyana was tearing strips from a clean cloth. "Where did you learn field medicine?" he gasped. "Same place I learned to read your maps. Carlisle Industrial School." Her hands were surprisingly gentle as she bound his shoulder. "They wanted to make us into proper Christian ladies, teach us to serve white families as maids and seamstresses." She smiled grimly. "I learned other skills instead, like fighting, like surviving." She built a small fire in a ring of stones, positioning it so the flames would be invisible from below. As darkness settled over the desert, she produced travel rations from her saddlebags, jerked meat, parched corn, and some kind of flat bread that tasted better than anything Gideon had eaten in weeks. "Tell me about your maps," she said as they ate. Gideon pulled the folded papers from his shirt pocket. Most had survived the massacre, though some bore bloodstains and bullet holes. The Kansas Pacific wants to build a southern route to California, bypass the snow problems in Colorado and Wyoming. Aiyana studied the careful lines and notations by firelight. This railroad would run through the heart of Apache lands. "The heart of what used to be Apache lands," Gideon corrected gently. "The treaties, your treaties." Her voice carried the chill of mountain wind. "Signed by chiefs who had no authority to speak for all Apache people. Papers that promise things your government never intended to give." She traced a line on the map with one finger. "This route passes directly through Red Rock Canyon, a place where my grandmother's grandmother is buried, where Apache children have received their adult names for 10 generations. I didn't know. Now you do." She looked up at him across the fire. "The question is, what will you do with that knowledge?" Gideon stared at the maps in his hands. 3 months of careful surveying, precise measurements, mathematical calculations that would guide thousands of tons of steel across a landscape older than memory. His work, his future. The Kansas Pacific had promised him a substantial bonus for completing the survey, enough money to buy land back in Kansas and maybe start his own engineering firm. These maps, he said slowly, if someone knew how to read them properly, they could predict exactly where the railroad would go. Yes, where the surveyors would camp, where they'd need water, where the track-laying crews would be most vulnerable. Aiyana's dark eyes reflected firelight like obsidian mirrors. Yes, someone could use that information to attack the railroad crews, delay construction, maybe stop it entirely. Perhaps. Gideon looked at the woman across the fire, this impossible warrior who could break men's bones with her bare hands, but tended his wounds with the gentleness of a trained nurse, who spoke English like a college graduate, but moved through the desert like smoke. "Why did you really save me back there?" he asked. Aiyana was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she spoke. 6 months ago, I rode into Apache Pass with a war party led by my uncle, Chief Running Eagle. We had heard rumors that soldiers were building a new fort, but we wanted to see for ourselves. Her voice grew distant. We found them torturing captured Apache women and children, trying to make them reveal the location of our winter camps. Gideon felt sick. The army doesn't... Captain Reynolds's brother was in charge of the interrogation, Lieutenant Marcus Reynolds. She stared into the fire. He had tied a 12-year-old Apache girl to a wagon wheel, was burning her feet with a hot iron trying to make her talk. Jesus. I killed him with my bare hands, snapped his neck like a dry branch. Her voice held no regret. The girl died anyway. Too badly burned, too broken. They sat in silence while the fire crackled and desert night sounds whispered around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. "That's why Reynolds hunts you," Gideon said finally. His brother was his only family. Marcus raised him after their parents died. Aiyana met his eyes. "I understand his grief. I would do the same. But you saved me. Because you tried to help me when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Because you asked questions instead of assuming answers." She folded the maps carefully. "And because these papers might be the key to saving what remains of my people." A new sound drifted across the desert, the distant whinny of a horse. Aiyana was on her feet instantly, every muscle tense. "Reynolds," Gideon whispered. She shook her head. "Different horses. Desert horses, not cavalry mounts." Her hand moved to her rifle. "Crow Dog has found our trail." In the darkness beyond their small fire, shapes moved like ghosts. The soft whisper of moccasins on stone, the barely audible click of weapons being readied. "How many?" Gideon breathed. Aiyana's smile was wolf-sharp, enough to make things interesting. The attack came without warning. Arrows hissed out of the darkness, one missing Gideon's head by inches to bury itself in a saguaro trunk. Aiyana rolled left, came up with her Spencer ready, and put a round center mass into the nearest attacker. The rifle's crack echoed off canyon walls like thunder. "Stay down!" she barked at Gideon, working the Spencer's lever with practiced speed. More figures rushed their position. In the firelight, Gideon could see painted faces, weapons glinting. These weren't cavalry or railroad men, they were Apache warriors. But something was wrong. Their war paint was mixed with white man's symbols. Silver crosses hung around their necks alongside traditional ornaments. "Crow Dog's band," Aiyana spat, firing again. "Apache who've sold their souls for Spanish gold." A warrior with a shaved head and scars covering half his face charged directly at her, wielding a cavalry saber. Aiyana dropped her rifle and drew her own blade, meeting his attack with a clash of steel that threw sparks. They fought like dancers, circling each other with lethal grace. The scarred warrior was fast, skilled, deadly, but Aiyana was something beyond human. She moved like water, like wind, her blade seeming to be everywhere at once. Gideon fumbled for his Winchester, trying to find a clear shot. but the combatants moved too quickly, flowing around each other in patterns too complex to follow in the uncertain light. Another attacker appeared at the edge of his vision, a young Apache with Spanish features carrying a shotgun. Gideon swung his rifle toward this new threat and fired without thinking. The man spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. "Maldito gringo!" the wounded man cursed, trying to bring his shotgun to bear. Gideon worked his Winchester's lever and fired again. This time the man stayed down. The clash of steel ended abruptly. The scarred warrior lay motionless beside their fire, Aiyana's blade buried between his ribs. She stood over his body, breathing hard blood running from a shallow cut on her cheek. "Is that all of them?" Gideon asked. For now, she retrieved her rifle and began reloading with mechanical efficiency. But Crow Dog is not with them. He sends others to test our defenses while he plans something worse. They broke camp immediately, riding deeper into the mountains by starlight. Aiyana led them through passages so narrow, Gideon's stirrups scraped rock walls, up slopes so steep, he had to lean forward and grip his horse's mane to keep from sliding backward. Dawn found them on a high plateau, overlooking a vast expanse of desert. In the distance, dust clouds marked the movement of multiple groups. Cavalry patrols, Apache war parties, perhaps bounty hunters drawn by the price on Aiyana's head. "We cannot stay ahead of them forever," she said, studying the movements below. "Too many enemies, too few places to hide." "Then what do you suggest?" Aiyana turned to look at him, and he saw something new in her dark eyes. Not desperation exactly, but a kind of fierce calculation. "I suggest we stop running," she said, "and start fighting back." She pulled his maps from her saddlebags and spread them across a flat rock. "You want to know why these papers are so valuable? Look here." Her finger traced a route through the mountains. "Your railroad would pass within 5 miles of Canyon de Chelly, sacred ground where Apache leaders have gathered for treaty councils since before your grandfathers were born. So in 3 days, Chief Running Eagle will meet there with leaders from 6 Apache bands. They are planning to unite their forces for one final campaign against the white settlements." Her smile was fierce. "Your maps show exactly how to find them." Gideon felt the pieces clicking together. Crow Dog means to sell the location to the cavalry. "And Captain Reynolds will surround the canyon during the council. Kill or capture every major Apache leader in one stroke." She folded the maps carefully. "It would end Apache resistance forever. Unless someone warns them first." "Yes." They looked at each other across the maps, both understanding what such a warning would mean. Gideon would be crossing a line from which there could be no return, choosing sides in a war where his own people wore blue uniforms and carried American flags. "If I help you," he said slowly, "I become a traitor to everything I was raised to believe. Yes, they'll hunt me like they hunt you. Yes, I'll never be able to go home again." Aiyana's expression softened slightly. "There are different kinds of home mapmaker, different kinds of family." In the distance, dust clouds continued their deadly dance across the desert floor. Somewhere down there, Captain Reynolds rode with his grief and his duty. Crow Dog plotted with his gold and his hatred. Chief Running Eagle prepared for a council that might be his death trap. And here, on this high plateau, a small man with careful hands and a warrior woman with midnight eyes studied maps that could change the fate of nations. Gideon Nash folded the papers and tucked them inside his shirt. "Canyon de Chelly," he said. "How far?" Aiyana's smile could have lit the dawn sky. 2 days hard riding," she replied. "If we leave now." They mounted their horses and rode toward a destiny written in blood and starlight, toward choices that would echo through generations, yet unborn. Behind them, the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The horses' hooves drummed against red stone as they descended into a labyrinth of canyons that seemed carved by the gods themselves. Aiyana led them through passages so ancient that petroglyphs covered every surface, spirals and handprints and hunting scenes that spoke of civilizations lost to time. The air grew cooler as they dropped deeper, carrying scents of sage and hidden water. "Stay close," Aiyana called back to Gideon. "These canyons are sacred ground. Step wrong and the spirits will lead you in circles until you die of thirst." Gideon guided his paint mare carefully along a ledge barely wide enough for a single horse. Below them, the canyon floor lay shrouded in purple shadows, while above the rim caught the last rays of afternoon sun like the edge of a golden blade. "How much farther to Running Eagle's camp?" he asked. "We will reach the outer sentries before sunset." Aiyana's voice carried a note of tension he hadn't heard before. "But first, we must deal with our shadows." Shadows. She reined in her stallion and pointed back the way they'd come. High on the canyon rim, barely visible against the sky, 3 riders sat motionless as statues. "Crow Dog scouts," she said. "They have been following us since dawn." Gideon squinted up at the distant figures. "How can you be sure?" "Because one of them rides a white horse with black markings. That is Little Wolf Crow Dog's cousin. I recognize his mount." Her hand moved to her rifle. "He is very good at tracking, but not so good at staying hidden." The lead scout raised something to his face. Field glasses, Gideon realized. Military issue, probably stolen from a cavalry patrol. "They're watching us," he said, "and counting our weapons, studying our route." Aiyana urged her horse forward again. "Little Wolf will report our position to Crow Dog, who will sell the information to Captain Reynolds. By tomorrow morning, the cavalry will know exactly where to find Running Eagle's council." The canyon walls closed in around them as they descended, blocking out the sky until only a narrow ribbon of blue remained visible overhead. Strange formations jutted from the rock-balanced stones that defied gravity, arches that framed views of distant mesas, caverns that exhaled cool air like the breath of sleeping giants. "This place feels alive," Gideon murmured. "It is alive." Aiyana's voice held reverence. "My grandmother told me that long ago, before the white men came, before even the Spanish came, this canyon was home to the ancient ones. They built cities in the cliff faces, cities that touched the sky. When they departed for the spirit world, they left guardians behind. Guardians. You will see." As if summoned by her words, figures emerged from hidden crevices in the canyon walls. Apache warriors, but unlike any Gideon had seen before. These men seemed carved from the rock itself, their faces painted with symbols that hurt to look at directly. They carried traditional weapons, bows, lances, war clubs, but they moved with a silence that was almost supernatural. Aiyana, the largest warrior, stepped forward, his voice echoing off canyon walls. He stood nearly as tall as she did, his broad chest marked with ritual scars. "You bring a white man to sacred ground. I bring a friend, Nalnish," she replied in English, though she could have spoken Apache. "One who risks his life to save our people." The warrior Nalnish studied Gideon with eyes like chips of obsidian. "He looks like a surveyor, a mapmaker for the Iron Horse." "He is, but he chooses to serve justice instead of gold." "Pretty words, but words are wind." Naalnish gestured, and more warriors appeared, a dozen men who seemed to materialize from solid rock. "Running Eagle has called the Great Council. Leaders from 6 bands ride to meet here. If this white man betrays us, then I will kill him myself," Aiyana said simply. The warriors conferred in rapid Apache, their voices too low for Gideon to follow. He caught only fragments, words that sounded like cavalry and railroad and sacred fire. Finally, Nalnish nodded. "You may pass, but the white man surrenders his weapons." "That's reasonable," Gideon said, reaching for his Winchester. "No!" Aiyana's voice cracked like a whip. "We keep our weapons or we turn back now." Nalnish's hand dropped to his war club. The other warriors shifted, creating a loose circle around them. Gideon felt the temperature drop as if storm clouds had suddenly blocked the sun. "You forget yourself, woman," Nalnish growled. "This is Apache land, Apache law. And Apache law says a warrior keeps her weapons until she chooses to lay them down." Aiyana's own hand moved to her saber hilt. "Or would you take them by force?" The two warriors stared at each other across a gulf that seemed deeper than the canyon around them. Gideon realized he was witnessing something more than a simple disagreement about weapons. This was about authority, about who had the right to make decisions, in a world where traditional structures were crumbling. "I trained you myself," Nalnish said quietly. "Taught you to read sign, to move unseen, to kill without sound. You were like a daughter to me." "You taught me to think for myself," Aiyana replied, "to question orders that make no sense, to choose my own path, even when that path leads to destruction. Especially then." One of the younger warriors stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "She speaks like a white woman, all demands no respect." Aiyana turned to face him, and Gideon saw something terrible in her expression. "You think I learned disrespect from white people, Hastian? Look around you. Our children sold to Mexican slavers, our sacred places torn up for railroad tracks, our leaders bought with whiskey and false promises." Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "I learned from white people, yes. I learned that sometimes you must become the monster to defeat the monster." The young warrior reached for his knife. Aiyana moved like lightning, covering the distance between them in 2 strides. Her hand closed around his wrist with an audible crack of bone. "But I also learned," she continued conversationally, as Hastian writhed in her grip, "that true strength comes from knowing when not to fight." She released him, and he stumbled backward, clutching his injured wrist. The other warriors watched in stunned silence. "We keep our weapons," Nalnish said finally, "but if you betray Running Eagle's trust, then may the spirits of my ancestors curse my bones to dust." Aiyana completed the traditional oath. They were escorted deeper into the canyon, where the walls opened into a vast amphitheater carved from living rock. Hidden springs fed a pool of water so clear it might have been air. Ancient cliff dwellings clung to the canyon walls like swallows' nests, their dark windows watching over everything below. And everywhere, Apache warriors. Gideon had never seen so many gathered in one place. Warriors from the Chiricahua, the Mescalero, the Western Apache bands that had been fighting each other for generations, now sitting around common fires. Some wore traditional clothing, others mixed Apache garments with items taken from defeated enemies. A few had adopted white man's weapons entirely, carrying rifles and pistols with the casual familiarity of professional soldiers. But it was the horses that truly amazed him. Hundreds of them grazing on grass that seemed impossibly green in this desert place. War horses, hunting horses, pack animals, a mobile wealth that represented the accumulated raids of a dozen Apache bands. "Impressive, is it not?" a new voice said behind them. They turned to see a man who could only be Chief Running Eagle himself. Tall and lean, with silver streaking his black hair, he wore the simple clothing of a traditional Apache leader. No elaborate headdress or ceremonial robes, just well-made buckskins and moccasins that had seen many miles. But his presence filled the amphitheater like the echo of thunder. "Grandfather," Aiyana said, using the Apache term of respect for an elder. "Granddaughter." Running Eagle's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "You bring interesting companions to our council fire." "I bring maps that show where the cavalry will strike next," she replied, "and a man brave enough to betray his own people to save ours." Running Eagle studied Gideon with eyes that seemed to see straight through flesh and bone to whatever lay beneath. "You are the map maker, the one who charts paths for the Iron Horse." "I was," Gideon said carefully. "Now I'm not sure what I am." "Uncertainty is the beginning of wisdom." The chief gestured toward the pool of clear water. "Come, we will speak of maps and iron horses and the price of choosing sides." They sat on smooth stones beside the spring, while Apache warriors maintained a respectful distance. Running Eagle produced a pipe carved from red stone and filled it with tobacco mixed with herbs that smelled of mountain wind. "Tell me about your railroad," he said, offering the pipe to Gideon. Gideon took a careful puff, trying not to cough, as the smoke burned his throat. "The Kansas Pacific wants to build a southern route to California. They sent me to survey the most efficient path through Apache territory." Efficient for whom? For shipping freight, moving people, connecting the eastern states with California markets. And Apache people, are we freight to be shipped, obstacles to be moved? Gideon met the chief's steady gaze. "According to the maps I was ordered to draw, you don't exist." Running Eagle nodded as if this confirmed something he already knew. "Show me these maps." Gideon spread the folded papers on a flat stone, weighing them down with smaller rocks. The careful lines and precise notations looked strange in this wild place, like fragments of a different world altogether. "Here," Gideon said, pointing to a series of parallel lines. "This is the proposed main route. It follows the Gila River through most of Arizona, then cuts north toward the Colorado. Through the heart of Chiricahua lands," Running Eagle observed. "Yes, but here," Gideon indicated a series of smaller marks. "These are alternate routes I surveyed, ways to go around the most sensitive areas." "Sensitive how?" Gideon hesitated. This was the moment of truth, the choice between his old life and whatever lay ahead. Sacred sites, burial grounds, places where water is scarce, and building a railroad would mean destroying Apache access to springs. Aiyana leaned forward, studying the maps more closely. "You drew these alternate routes on your own, without orders from the railroad." "Without orders. Against orders, actually. I was supposed to chart the most direct path regardless of complications." "Why did you change the plan?" Running Eagle asked. "Because I started seeing the land differently, started understanding what those places meant to the people who lived here." Gideon touched a spot on the map where he'd marked a spring. 3 months ago, I camped beside this water source, found pottery shards, grinding stones, evidence that people had been coming there for centuries. It seemed wrong to destroy something that old, just to save a few miles of track laying. The chief smoked in silence for several moments, his eyes never leaving Gideon's face. Around them, the sounds of the Apache camp continued, horses, nickering men talking in low voices, the distant laughter of children playing some ancient game. "Crow Dog seeks to sell our location to the cavalry," Running Eagle said finally. "You know this. Aiyana told me. That's why we came, to warn you." "And what do you think we should do with this warning?" Gideon looked around the amphitheater at the gathered warriors, the hundreds of horses, the cliff dwellings that had stood for 1,000 years. "I think you should disappear, scatter to places the cavalry can't follow, wait for a better opportunity." "Run, you mean? Survive." Running Eagle's laugh held no humor. "For 50 years, my people have survived by running from soldiers, from settlers, from the Iron Horse itself. Each time we run, we lose something: hunting grounds, sacred places, the graves of our ancestors. How much can a people lose and still call themselves a people? Better than losing everything in one final battle. Is it?" The chief rose and walked to the edge of the pool, where water bubbled up from depths that seemed to have no bottom. "My grandfather fought against the Spanish. My father fought against the Mexicans. I have fought against the Americans. Each generation has had to choose between resistance and submission, between death with honor and life without dignity." He turned back to face them. "What would you choose, mapmaker? If soldiers came to destroy everything you held sacred, would you run or would you fight?" Gideon thought about his own past, growing up on a Kansas farm, watching his father struggle against drought and debt, and the railroad companies that charged whatever the market would bear. "I'd probably run and spend the rest of my life regretting it." "An honest answer." Running Eagle resumed his seat. "But honesty is not enough. We need solutions." Aiyana spread the maps wider, pointing to a series of canyons north of their current position. What if we gave them a battle but not the battle they expect? Let Crow Dog report our location as planned, but when the cavalry arrives, we're already gone. They would simply track us to our new position. Not if we split the bands, send each group in a different direction along routes the mapmaker's papers don't show. Her finger traced paths through unmapped territory. The cavalry cannot follow 6 different trails with equal force. And then what? We spend the rest of our lives as scattered refugees? No. Gideon spoke up suddenly, an idea taking shape in his mind. Then you use my maps against the railroad itself. Both Aiyana and Running Eagle stared at him. I don't understand, the chief said. Gideon pulled out a pencil and began marking the maps with quick, precise strokes. The railroad survey shows every supply depot, every construction camp, every vulnerable point along the proposed route. If someone wanted to delay construction, maybe permanently, these maps would tell them exactly where to strike. You're talking about war against the railroad, Aiyana said. I'm talking about using the railroad's own intelligence against them. They sent me to map their path to victory. Instead, I'll give you the tools to ensure their defeat. Running Eagle leaned forward, studying the new marks Gideon had added to the maps. This supply depot here, how many men guard it? 20, maybe 30, mostly teamsters and laborers, not soldiers. And this construction camp, 50 workers, a few armed guards. They're building a bridge across Sulphur Creek. If that bridge were destroyed, the entire project would be delayed for months. Running Eagle finished. Perhaps years. They spent the next hour going over the maps in detail, with Gideon explaining the railroad's vulnerabilities and the Apache leaders planning how to exploit them. Other chiefs joined the discussion. Storm Cloud of the western Apache, Fierce Wind of the Mescalero, Gray Fox from the northern Chiricahua. Men who had spent decades fighting white encroachment now found themselves studying railroad timetables and supply schedules with the intensity of military strategists. As the sun set and cooking fires began to flicker throughout the camp, a new sound drifted down into the canyon, the distant bugle call of cavalry. Every conversation stopped. Warriors reached for weapons with movements so swift and silent they seemed choreographed. Horses pricked their ears and shifted nervously. How far? Running Eagle asked Na'alnish, who had climbed partway up the canyon wall to listen. 2 miles, maybe less. A full company riding hard. Crow Dog's information was better than we expected, Aiyana said grimly, or his payment was larger. Running Eagle rose, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the approaching threat. How long to clear the camp? 10 minutes to load essential supplies, 20 to move the horses. We don't have 20 minutes, Gideon said. If I can hear their bugles, they'll be at the canyon mouth in 5. The chief nodded thoughtfully. Then we fight. Against a full cavalry company, that's suicide. Perhaps, or perhaps it is exactly what we need. Running Eagle smiled, and for a moment, Gideon glimpsed the fierce warrior who had been raiding white settlements since before Gideon was born. You think like a white man map maker, always calculating odds, always seeking the safest path. But sometimes the most dangerous choice is the only one that leads to victory. Orders flew in rapid Apache as the camp transformed itself with startling efficiency. Warriors who had been relaxing around cooking fires suddenly became a disciplined fighting force. Horses were led into hidden alcoves among the cliff dwellings. Women and children disappeared into caves that seemed to swallow them completely. In minutes, the amphitheater looked almost deserted. Almost. Carefully positioned behind rocks and in natural shooting positions, dozens of Apache warriors waited with the patience of hunters. Their weapons ranged from traditional bows to captured cavalry carbines, but every man knew exactly where to aim and when to fire. "Where do you want us?" Aiyana asked. Running Eagle pointed to a position near the pool, where fallen rocks provided excellent cover. "Keep the mapmaker alive. If this goes badly, his knowledge dies with him. And if it goes well, Then perhaps we begin to win this war." The sound of horses echoed off canyon walls as Captain Reynolds led his company down the narrow trail. Gideon counted blue uniforms through gaps in the rocks. 40 soldiers, maybe more, riding in column formation with their weapons ready. At their head rode a man who could only be Reynolds himself, his face grim beneath the brim of his campaign hat. "There," Reynolds called, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The Apache camp, just as Crow Dog described." They rode into the amphitheater, cautiously spreading out in skirmish formation. Gideon could see the captain's eyes scanning the cliff dwellings, the spring, the scattered remains of cooking fires, looking for the trap he knew must be waiting. "Sergeant Morrison," Reynolds said quietly. "Sir, this feels wrong, too easy. Maybe they ran when they heard us coming, sir. Apache don't run from 40 soldiers, not when they're defending sacred ground." Reynolds drew his service revolver. "Dismount the men. Prepare for—" Running Eagle rose from behind a boulder like an ancient god of war, his rifle steady in his hands. "Captain Reynolds," he said in perfect English, "you are not welcome here." The cavalry captain wheeled his horse to face this new threat, his own weapon coming up. "Chief Running Eagle, I presume. You're under arrest for violation of the territorial treaty." "What treaty?" "The one your government breaks whenever it suits your purposes. Surrender now, and your people will be treated according to military law." Running Eagle's laugh echoed off the canyon walls. "Military law, like the law that protected Apache women and children at Apache Pass." Reynolds's face went pale. "That was a mistake, an unauthorized action. By your brother." "Yes, I know." The chief's voice remained conversational, but his rifle never wavered. "I also know why you hunt the woman who killed him. She murdered a United States Army officer. She executed a torturer of children." The two men stared at each other across the ancient amphitheater, representatives of civilizations that seemed impossible to reconcile. Behind Reynolds, 40 cavalry troopers sat their horses with weapons drawn. Hidden among the rocks, Apache warriors waited for their chief's signal. "I'll make you a bargain, Captain," Running Eagle said finally. "Single combat, you and me. Your best warrior against mine, winner takes all." "This isn't some medieval romance, Chief. I have my orders. And I have mine, from spirits older than your nation." Running Eagle stepped forward, and Gideon saw other warriors beginning to rise from concealment. Not attacking, just revealing themselves, letting the cavalry see exactly how outnumbered they were. "But perhaps we can find another solution." "I'm listening." "Your brother died because he forgot that Apache children are still children, that Apache women are still women, that some things are sacred, even in war." The chief lowered his rifle slightly. "Leave now and no one else dies today. Continue to hunt Aiyana, and every man in your command will feed the buzzards before the sun sets." Reynolds looked around the amphitheater, finally understanding the true nature of the trap he'd ridden into. Apache warriors seemed to be everywhere now, on the canyon rim, among the cliff dwellings, behind every rock and tree. His 40 soldiers suddenly looked very small indeed. "How do I know you'll keep your word?" he asked. "Because unlike your government, Apache leaders do not lie to their enemies." Running Eagle's smile was sharp as a blade. "We save our lives for our friends." For a long moment the canyon held its breath. Then Reynolds slowly holstered his revolver. "Column, withdraw," he called. "Sir," Sergeant Morrison looked confused. "We have them outnumbered." "No, Sergeant, they have us outgunned." Reynolds turned his horse toward the canyon mouth. "Sometimes the wisest course is to live to fight another day." As the cavalry filed out of the amphitheater, Running Eagle called after them. "Captain," Reynolds turned in his saddle. "Next time you come to sacred ground," the chief said, "bring more soldiers, or better prayers." The cavalry disappeared up the trail, leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats. Apache warriors began emerging from hiding places that had seemed empty moments before. Gideon counted at least 60, with more still concealed among the rocks. "That was incredible," he breathed. "That was foolish," Aiyana said grimly. "Reynolds will be back with twice as many men, and next time he won't ride into a trap." Running Eagle nodded. "Which is why we leave tonight, and why your maps have become more valuable than ever." He turned to Gideon. "You offered to help us wage war against the railroad. I accept that offer. What do you need me to do? Draw us new maps, not the ones that show where the railroad wants to go, but ones that show where it can be stopped." The chief's eyes glittered with something that might have been hope. "Help us turn your iron horse into scrap metal and broken dreams." As darkness fell over the canyon, Apache warriors began the complex task of breaking camp without leaving traces. Horses were led out through hidden passages. Supplies were loaded onto pack animals with the efficiency of long practice. The cooking fires were scattered and covered the spring, left as pristine as if humans had never touched it. But in a cave high up the canyon wall, by the light of a carefully shielded lantern, Gideon Nash bent over fresh paper and began drawing maps that would change the course of a war. Maps that showed not where railroads should go, but where they could be destroyed. Not the dreams of distant investors, but the nightmares of Apache vengeance. Beside him, Aiyana cleaned her weapons and prepared for the long journey ahead. Tomorrow they would ride out to challenge an empire. Tonight they planned the first steps of a revolution written in steel and gunpowder, measured in miles of track and gallons of blood. The canyon gradually emptied as the Apache bands dispersed to their assigned destinations, following routes that existed on no white man's map. But the alliance forged in this sacred place would endure, bound together by common purpose and the fragile hope that resistance might still triumph over submission. By dawn, Canyon de Chelly stood empty again, holding its secrets close. But the real battle was just beginning. The first railroad supply depot burned like a torch against the pre-dawn sky, sending pillars of black smoke spiraling into the desert air. Gideon crouched behind a cluster of barrel cacti, watching flames consume 3 months' worth of railroad ties, steel rails, and construction equipment, while Apache warriors melted back into the darkness like shadows at sunrise. "How much did we cost them?" Aiyana asked, appearing beside him, with the silence of wind through grass. Gideon consulted the notes he'd scribbled on the back of his map. "Conservative estimate $50,000 in materials. 6 months of construction delays while they ship replacement supplies from Kansas." He folded the paper carefully. "But the real damage isn't the money. It's the fear. Fear. Every railroad worker from here to California is going to hear about this raid. They'll start demanding combat pay, armed escorts, hazard bonuses. Some will quit outright." He smiled grimly in the firelight. "Fear costs more than steel." They had struck 3 targets in 5 days, moving through the desert like hunting wolves. The supply depot at Willow Creek, a construction camp where workers were laying track across Mescal Wash, a survey team that had been mapping alternate routes through the Dragoon Mountains. Each attack precisely planned from Gideon's railroad maps, each strike calculated to cause maximum disruption with minimal Apache casualties. "The patterns are too obvious," Aiyana said as they mounted their horses. "Reynolds will start to see connections. Let him see them. By the time he figures out our strategy, we'll have crippled half the railroad's infrastructure in Arizona territory." Gideon urged his paint mare into a steady lope heading northeast toward their next target. "Besides, patterns work both ways." "What do you mean?" "Reynolds is predictable too. Every time we hit a railroad target, he responds the same way, sends cavalry patrols to guard the remaining sites. But he doesn't have enough men to protect everything at once." They rode through landscapes that seemed painted by fever dreams, red mesas jutting from purple valleys, forests of saguaro cacti standing like ancient sentinels, hidden canyons where springs bubbled up from underground rivers older than memory. This was Apache country, every stone and shadow familiar to Aiyana while remaining alien to most white men. As the sun climbed toward noon, they reached a ridge overlooking their next objective, the railroad bridge spanning Devil's Canyon. A marvel of engineering, the wooden trestle stretched 300 feet across a gorge deep enough to swallow a 10-story building. Trains would cross this bridge carrying passengers and freight from the eastern railheads to California markets. But first, the structure had to be completed. 40 workers, Gideon reported, studying the construction site through field glasses. Maybe a dozen armed guards. Most of the heavy work is done, they're just installing the final deck sections. And if we destroy it, the railroad has to start over. New surveys, new engineering plans, possibly a completely different route. We're talking about years of delays, not months. Aiyana took the field glasses and swept them across the bridge site. I count 6 sentries, positioned here, here, and here. She pointed to guard posts at either end of the bridge and along the approach roads. Standard military formation. Reynolds trained them well, too well. For what we have planned, not nearly well enough. They had been joined by Stormcloud's warriors 3 days earlier, 20 Apache fighters who moved through rough country like smoke through wind. Men who could track a deer across solid rock, who could kill silently with bow or blade, who had been fighting white soldiers since before Gideon was born. Now those warriors lay hidden in positions around the bridge site, invisible to the guards who scanned the surrounding terrain with increasing nervousness. Word of the railroad raids had spread, and every white man in Arizona territory knew that Apache war parties were hunting railroad targets. Remember, Aiyana said as they prepared to descend toward the bridge, we want the workers to run, not fight. Kill only if we must. And the guards are soldiers. They chose their path. The attack began at sunset when long shadows provided perfect concealment for Apache movement. Stormcloud's warriors struck the guard posts simultaneously, overwhelming the sentries with speed and numbers rather than firepower. Most of the railroad workers dropped their tools and ran for the hills the moment they heard gunfire, but not all of them. Behind the supply wagon, someone shouted, form a defensive line. A handful of workers and guards had barricaded themselves behind construction equipment near the bridge's eastern approach. These men had military training, probably Civil War veterans, who'd seen too much combat to panic under fire. They had good positions, adequate ammunition, and the desperate courage of men fighting for their lives. Flush them out, Stormcloud called to his warriors. Wait! Gideon rose from his concealment, ignoring Aiyana's hissed warning. Let me try something first. He walked toward the barricade with his hands raised, his surveyor's gear clearly visible. A man in work clothes but carrying a cavalry carbine peered over the supply wagon. That's far enough, mister. State your business. My name is Gideon Nash. I'm the surveyor who mapped this route for the Kansas Pacific Railroad Company. You're with the railroad. I was. Now I'm with them. Gideon gestured toward the Apache positions. These warriors could kill every man behind that wagon in the next 5 minutes, but they'd rather not. Why? Because you're workers, not soldiers. Because some of you probably have families back east who depend on your wages. Because killing you serves no purpose except revenge, and revenge is a luxury these people can't afford. The man with the carbine, a supervisor from his bearing, considered this. What do you want from us? Walk away. Leave your weapons and your equipment, take your horses, and ride back to Tucson. Tell everyone you meet that the railroad isn't safe in Apache country anymore. And if we refuse, Gideon looked around at the darkening desert where Apache warriors waited with the patience of hunting cats. Then you'll die here for the profit margins of men who've never seen Arizona territory and never will. Long silence. Then the supervisor slowly laid down his carbine. Boys, he called to his men, pack it up, we're going home. As the railroad workers rode away into the gathering darkness, Apache warriors emerged from concealment to begin the delicate work of destroying the bridge. They couldn't simply burn it wet desert air, and green timber would resist flame. Instead, they used techniques Stormcloud had learned during raids on army supply lines, cutting through critical support beams and loosening key joints until the entire structure became fatally weakened. When the next locomotive tries to cross, Stormcloud explained, the bridge will collapse under its weight. The engine will fall 300 feet into the canyon, along with whatever cars it's pulling. How many people will die? Gideon asked. That depends on how much cargo the train carries. Freight trains have crews of 4 or 5 men. Passenger trains... Stormcloud shrugged. More. Gideon felt ice in his stomach. He'd been thinking about railroad raids in terms of military objectives, disrupting construction, delaying completion, forcing the company to reconsider their route. But when the bridge collapsed, real people would die. Engineers, conductors, passengers who'd paid for safe passage to California. We have to warn them, he said. Warn who? Aiyana looked at him with something that might have been disappointment. The railroad. Send word that the bridge is unsafe, so they can repair it and continue building through Apache lands. So innocent people don't die for a war they never chose to fight. Stormcloud spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone harsh. Aiyana replied in the same language, their voices rising as the argument intensified. Finally, she turned back to Gideon. Stormcloud says you think like a white man, that you care more about enemy lives than Apache victory. What do you say? I say that mercy is a luxury warriors cannot afford. But her voice carried doubt. This is war, Gideon. People die in wars. Wrong people died in my war, he said quietly. I was at Antietam with the Army of the Potomac, saw 18,000 men cut down in a single day, most of them boys who'd never fired a shot in anger before that morning. You know what I learned, that killing innocent people doesn't make you strong. It makes you into the thing you're fighting against. Pretty words. But will pretty words stop the railroad? Better words might. Words in the right newspapers reaching the right people. Gideon pulled out paper and pencil, began writing by the light of a hooded lantern. What if we tell the story differently? Not Apache savages attacking innocent railroad workers, but a desperate people defending their homeland against corporate invaders. Who would publish such a story? Eastern newspapers love David and Goliath tales, especially when David has right on his side. He wrote quickly, sketching out a dispatch that emphasized the railroad's broken promises, the government's violated treaties, the Apache band's legitimate grievances. Send this to the San Francisco Chronicle, the Chicago Tribune, maybe even Harper's Weekly. Let people back east read about what's really happening out here. Stormcloud had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience. Now he spoke in rapid Apache, his voice sharp with anger. He says you are weak, Aiyana translated, that you want to fight a war with paper when only blood will stop the iron horse. Ask him how many Apache warriors died fighting the cavalry last year, Gideon replied. Then ask him how many railroad workers we've killed in 5 days. Stormcloud's expression grew thoughtful as Aiyana posed the questions. When she translated his answer, Gideon nodded grimly. 63 Apache dead in cavalry fights. 0 railroad workers killed in our raids. Which strategy protects Apache lives better? But which strategy wins the war? Aiyana asked. Maybe they're the same strategy. As dawn approached, they finished their work on the bridge and prepared to move to their next target. But first, Gideon wrote a second message, a brief warning to the railroad superintendent in Tucson that the Devil's Canyon Bridge had been sabotaged and should be inspected before any trains attempted to cross. You realize this warning will be traced back to us, Aiyana said as she watched him write. Good. Let them know we're not mindless killers. Let them understand that Apache warriors can show mercy even to their enemies. And when they repair the bridge, Then we destroy it again and again if necessary. But we do it when the bridge is empty, when no innocent lives are at stake. They sent both messages with Running Eagle's fastest riders, the warning to reach Tucson before any trains could attempt the crossing, the newspaper dispatch to travel by telegraph to editorial offices across the nation. Then they mounted their horses and rode deeper into the desert, following trails that existed on no white man's map. 3 days later, they learned the results of their gamble. The telegraph operator in Tucson had received Gideon's warning just 2 hours before the 8:15 freight train was scheduled to depart for California. Railroad officials initially dismissed the message as a hoax, but the bridge inspector they sent to Devil's Canyon discovered the sabotage exactly as described. The train was canceled, the bridge closed for repairs, and every newspaper in Arizona Territory carried the story. But there was more. The San Francisco Chronicle had not only published Gideon's account of the railroad raids, they'd run it as a front-page story under the headline, "Apache David Battles Railroad Goliath." The Chicago Tribune picked up the story 2 days later. Within a week, editorial writers from Boston to Sacramento were debating the ethics of Western expansion and the treatment of indigenous peoples. "Listen to this," Aiyana said, reading from a week-old copy of the New York Herald that had somehow found its way to their hidden camp in the Chiricahua Mountains. "The question facing our nation is not whether we can build railroads through Indian lands, but whether we should. The Apache resistance, led by the remarkable warrior woman known as Aiyana and supported by a renegade railroad surveyor, has exposed the moral bankruptcy of corporate expansion at any cost." "They spelled your name right," Gideon observed. "They called you a renegade. Better than what they called me in Kansas after I left the railroad." He stirred the small cooking fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky. "Do you think it's working? The newspaper campaign? Railroad stock prices have dropped 12% in the past 2 weeks. Construction crews are demanding double wages to work in Apache territory. 3 Eastern investors have withdrawn funding from the Southern Route project." Aiyana folded the newspaper carefully. "Yes, I think it's working. But Storm Cloud still wants a real war. Storm Cloud has watched his people die slowly for 20 years. Disease, starvation, broken treaties, broken promises. To him, even death in battle seems better than death on the reservation." They had been living like this for 3 weeks now, striking railroad targets, melting back into the desert, moving constantly to stay ahead of Captain Reynolds's cavalry patrols. It was a hard life, dangerous and uncertain, but Gideon found himself adapting to it with surprising ease. His surveyor's skills translated well to guerrilla warfare, reading terrain, calculating distances, planning routes that would confuse pursuit. And there was something else. Something he didn't dare name but couldn't ignore. The way Aiyana moved through the desert like a force of nature. The way she planned attacks with the precision of a chess master and executed them with the grace of a dancer. The way she looked at him sometimes as if seeing possibilities that neither of them had words for. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "Next, when this war ends. When the railroad finds another route or gives up entirely, or when we're all dead." She poked at the fire with her own stick, avoiding his eyes. "You cannot go back to your old life, Gideon. Too many people know your name now. Too many bridges burned." "I know. And I cannot stay in Apache country forever. Reynolds will catch me eventually, or Crow Dog will sell my location to someone with more soldiers than sense. So what do you suggest?" Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. Apache horses moving fast, but not in panic. A messenger then bringing news from one of the other war parties. The rider who emerged from the darkness was young, barely 16, but he carried himself with the confidence of a seasoned warrior. Blood streaked his face from a shallow cut, and his horse showed signs of hard travel. "Storm Cloud is dead," he announced without preamble. "Crow Dog found our camp near Skeleton Creek. Brought 50 men, Apache turncoats, Mexican bandits, white bounty hunters. We fought them for 2 hours before—" He shuddered. "Storm cloud died covering our retreat. Most of the war party scattered." Aiyana closed her eyes, her face suddenly looking much older. "How many others?" "6 warriors dead, 4 captured." The young messenger's voice cracked slightly. "Crow Dog has put prices on all our heads. $500 for any warrior, 1,000 for you, 1,500 for the white mapmaker." Gideon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. $1,500. "Someone in Washington wants you very badly," Aiyana said grimly. "Dead or alive, I imagine." "There's more," the messenger continued. "Running Eagle has called a gathering, all remaining war parties plus delegates from bands that haven't joined the fighting, 3 days from now at the old Spanish mission near Dragoon Springs." "What's left of Father Thomas's mission?" Gideon asked. "That place has been abandoned for years." "Which makes it perfect for a secret meeting." Aiyana was already moving, rolling up her blankets and checking her weapons. "We leave at first light." "Is it safe?" Crow Dog probably knows about the mission too. "Nowhere is safe anymore, but some places are less dangerous than others." They rode through country that grew more desolate with each mile, broken mesas, alkali flats where nothing grew but thorny shrubs, canyons carved by flash floods that might come once in a decade. This was the true desert, the land beyond maps, where only Apache warriors and the hardiest prospectors dared to venture. The ruins of Father Thomas's mission appeared on the horizon, like a mirage, crumbling adobe walls, a bell tower that leaned at a precarious angle, empty windows that stared blindly across the wasteland. Spanish missionaries had built this place in the 1750s, hoping to convert Apache souls to Christianity. The Apache had let them stay for 20 years before quietly reclaiming the land. Now the mission served a different purpose. As they approached, Gideon could see horses hidden among the ruins, dozens of them representing war parties from across Apache territory. Warriors who had been fighting separately were gathering for what might be their final council. "How many?" he asked. "Maybe 100 fighters, representatives from 8 or 9 bands." Aiyana guided her stallion through gaps in the mission walls. Not nearly enough for a conventional war, but perhaps enough for something else. They found Running Eagle in what had once been the mission chapel, sitting before an altar where wooden crosses had been replaced by sacred Apache symbols. The chief looked older than when they'd seen him at Canyon de Shelly, his face marked by the weight of recent losses. "Granddaughter," he said as Aiyana approached. "Mapmaker, you received our message." "We heard about Storm Cloud," Gideon said. "I'm sorry. Storm Cloud died as he lived fighting for his people's freedom. There are worse ways for a warrior to leave this world." The chief rose, his movements still fluid despite his years. "But his death has changed our situation. We can no longer pretend that small raids will be enough." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Crow Dog has forced our hand. He knows our locations, our movements, our plans. Soon Captain Reynolds will have that information too." Running Eagle gestured around the ruined chapel. "This may be the last time Apache war leaders gather in one place." Other chiefs began filing into the chapel: Gray Fox, Fierce Wind, Iron Shirt, names that had become legendary throughout the Southwest. Men who had fought Mexican armies and American cavalry, who had led raids from the Rio Grande to the Colorado River. Seeing them together in this sacred space, Gideon finally understood the magnitude of what was happening. "You're planning something big," he said. "We are planning the end," Running Eagle replied, "one way or another." The council that followed lasted through the night and into the next day. Apache leaders debated strategies that ranged from total war to negotiated surrender, from mass migration to Mexico, to a final apocalyptic battle that would either destroy their enemies or themselves. Voices rose and fell in the ancient rhythms of tribal democracy, where every warrior had the right to speak and no decision could be made without consensus. Gideon found himself caught between worlds, understanding enough Apache to follow the broad arguments, but missing the cultural nuances that gave them meaning. When the chiefs asked for his advice, he tried to offer the perspective of someone who had seen both sides of the conflict. "The railroad will be completed eventually," he said. "If not this route, then another. If not this company, then a different one. You cannot stop the tide of westward expansion, but you might be able to channel it." "Explain," Gray Fox demanded. "Negotiate from strength while you still have strength to negotiate with. Use the newspaper coverage, the public sympathy, the political pressure in Washington. Force the government to honor existing treaties to guarantee Apache rights to specific lands. And in return, allow the railroad to pass through Apache territory along agreed routes. Tax the cargo charge fees for passage, but don't try to stop it entirely." Iron Shirt spoke up, his voice heavy with skepticism. "You want us to become toll collectors for the white man's iron horse." "I want you to survive," Gideon replied. "To find a way for Apache people to exist in a world that's changing whether you want it to or not." The debate continued for hours with no clear resolution emerging. Some chiefs favored Gideon's pragmatic approach, others preferred Stormcloud's militant resistance, still others advocated retreat to Mexico or the northern mountains. As the sun set on the second day, Running Eagle called for silence. "We have talked enough," he said. "Tomorrow we decide. But tonight we remember who we are." What followed was unlike anything Gideon had ever experienced. Apache warriors, men who had been killing and dying for their people's freedom, gathered around fires to sing songs that were older than European memory. They told stories of heroes and monsters of spirits who lived in sacred mountains of the time before time, when animals could speak and the world was young. Aiyana sat beside him as they listened, her face illuminated by firelight, her eyes reflecting depths he was only beginning to fathom. "What will you choose?" he asked quietly. "If the council decides to negotiate, I will follow Running Eagle's wisdom," she said, "as I always have. And if they choose to fight, then I will die fighting. There might be other options." She turned to look at him directly, such as, "We could leave together, find some place beyond the reach of cavalry and railroad companies and bounty hunters." "Run away, you mean? Start over? Build something new?" For a moment, her expression softened. In the firelight, she looked younger, more vulnerable, like a woman who might choose love over duty if the choice were offered clearly enough. Then the moment passed. "I am Apache Gideon. These are my people. This is my land. I cannot simply walk away, even if staying means dying. Especially then." They were interrupted by a commotion near the mission entrance. Sentries were challenging someone, voices raised in alarm. Then Gideon heard a familiar sound that made his blood run cold. The jingle of cavalry spurs, the creak of military leather. Captain Reynolds walked into the firelight alone, his hands raised to show he carried no weapons. Behind him, barely visible in the darkness, Gideon could make out the shapes of mounted soldiers, a full company at least positioned to surround the mission. "Chief Running Eagle," Reynolds said formally, "I request the right to speak under a flag of truce." Running Eagle rose slowly, his hand resting on his knife hilt. "You have no flag, Captain. Then I speak under the protection of Apache hospitality. Will you hear my words?" The chief considered this. Around the fires, Apache warriors had gone silent, their weapons within easy reach. This was unprecedented, an American cavalry officer walking alone into an Apache war council, trusting his life to enemy honor. "Speak," Running Eagle said finally. Reynolds looked around the circle of firelit faces, his gaze lingering on Aiyana before settling on Gideon. "I have a message from Washington. The territorial governor has authorized me to offer terms for the cessation of hostilities." "What terms?" "Recognition of Apache sovereignty over designated lands, federal protection for sacred sites, compensation for damages caused by railroad construction. Reynolds paused. And amnesty for all Apache fighters, including those who have committed acts of war against United States forces. The silence that followed was so complete that Gideon could hear his own heartbeat. These were better terms than any Apache leader had been offered in 20 years of warfare, recognition, compensation, amnesty. Everything they had been fighting for handed to them by their greatest enemy. And in return, Running Eagle asked, an end to attacks on railroad construction, Apache cooperation in completing the southern route through designated corridors, and the surrender of one individual for trial under territorial law. Which individual? Reynolds's eyes found Gideon across the fire. The renegade surveyor known as Gideon Nash, wanted for treason, sedition, and conspiracy against the United States government. The words hung in the desert air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Every eye in the ruined chapel turned toward Gideon, measuring him, weighing his life against the future of their people. Captain Reynolds stood motionless in the firelight, his offer delivered with the precision of a military dispatch. Apache freedom in exchange for one white man's blood. No, Aiyana said, the single word cutting through the silence like a blade. The decision is not yours to make, Reynolds replied without taking his eyes off Running Eagle. This is a matter between governments. Apache people do not surrender their allies to their enemies, Running Eagle said carefully. It would be, unfortunate for our honor. Your honor. Reynolds's voice carried the weight of months of frustration, of chasing shadows through impossible terrain while his brother's death remained unavenged. What about the honor of a United States Army officer? What about justice for Lieutenant Marcus Reynolds? Your brother tortured children, Aiyana spoke again, rising to her feet with fluid grace. Apache justice has already been served. The captain's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm before he remembered where he was surrounded by 100 Apache warriors who could kill him before he cleared leather. Instead, he forced his voice back to professional calm. Miss Aiyana, is it? You are also wanted by territorial authorities. The governor's amnesty could extend to you as well under the right circumstances. What circumstances? Surrender the mapmaker, publicly renounce violence against railroad construction, accept relocation to the Mescalero Reservation in New Mexico. Aiyana's laugh held no humor. The reservation where Apache children die of white man's diseases, where warriors become beggars for government rations. She shook her head. You offer slavery and call it amnesty. I offer survival. You offer death by inches instead of death with honor. Some bargains are too expensive, Captain. Gideon had been listening to this exchange with growing dread, watching Apache faces around the fires as they considered Reynolds's proposal. He could see the temptation in their eyes, peace, recognition, an end to the constant running and fighting and dying. All they had to do was hand over one white man who had chosen their cause over his own people. Chief Running Eagle, he said, standing slowly. May I speak? The old chief nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. Captain Reynolds is right about one thing. This decision affects more than just my life. If the Apache refuse his terms, the war continues. More warriors die, more children go hungry, more sacred places get destroyed by railroad construction. Gideon looked around the circle of fire-lit faces. But if they accept his terms, they gain everything they've been fighting for. You would surrender yourself, Gray Fox asked. To save Apache lives, to end this war, yes, I would. Gideon, no. Aiyana stepped closer, her voice urgent. You don't understand what they'll do to you. Treason is a hanging offense, and continued resistance is a dying offense for your people. At least my death might serve some purpose. Running Eagle raised his hand for silence. Captain Reynolds, your terms are noted, but such decisions cannot be made in haste. Apache leaders must deliberate, must seek guidance from the spirits of our ancestors. How long do you need? Until dawn. When the sun rises, you will have our answer." Reynolds nodded curtly. "Until dawn, then. But understand, if you refuse these terms, there will be no others. The full weight of the United States Army will fall on Apache resistance. No quarter given, no mercy shown." "We understand the nature of white man's mercy," Running Eagle replied. "We have seen it at Sand Creek, at Wounded Knee, at Apache Pass." The captain's face flushed, but he maintained his composure. "Until dawn," he repeated, then turned and walked back into the darkness where his soldiers waited. As soon as Reynolds disappeared, the Apache Council erupted into heated debate. Chiefs argued in rapid-fire Apache, while warriors gestured toward the mission walls, where cavalry waited in the darkness. Some voices favored accepting the government's terms. The offer was better than anything they could have imagined 6 months ago. Others insisted that surrender was surrender, regardless of the promises attached. Gideon found himself at the center of the storm, with Apache leaders demanding to know his thoughts on everything from territorial law to reservation conditions to the likelihood that Washington would honor its agreements. But his attention kept drifting to Aiyana, who sat apart from the main discussion with her face turned toward the stars. "You're thinking about running," he said, settling beside her on a chunk of fallen masonry. "I'm thinking about choices," she replied without looking at him, "about the difference between wisdom and cowardice. Sometimes they're the same thing, and sometimes they're not." She turned to face him, her dark eyes reflecting starlight. "Tell me honestly, do you believe Reynolds's promises?" Gideon considered the question carefully. "I believe he thinks he's telling the truth. Whether the government will honor those promises once they have what they want, that's a different question. You think they'll break the treaty. I think governments break treaties when it's convenient and honor them when it's profitable. The trick is making sure it's always more profitable to keep their word." "How?" "Publicity, documentation, making sure the whole world is watching." He gestured toward the ruins around them. "This mission used to be a symbol of Spanish power in Apache lands. Now it's a pile of broken stones that tourists visit to take photographs. Power is temporary, Aiyana, but stories last forever. Stories don't stop bullets. Sometimes they do. The newspaper coverage of our raids has done more to protect Apache interests than 20 years of warfare. Eastern politicians are asking questions about Western expansion policies. Railroad investors are nervous about projects in Indian territory. Public opinion is shifting. Not fast enough to save the warriors who'll die tomorrow if we refuse Reynolds's terms." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the ongoing debate and the distant sounds of cavalry horses, restless in the darkness. Somewhere among the ruins, sentries watched for any sign of treachery from the soldiers surrounding them. "There's another option," Aiyana said finally, "which is, we take the decision out of their hands. Disappear before dawn, force them to choose between war and negotiation without using your life as a bargaining chip." Gideon felt a flutter of hope quickly suppressed. "Run away together. Strategically withdraw to a more defensible position," she corrected with a slight smile. "There are places in the Sierra Madre Mountains where even Crow Dog's trackers can't follow. Caves, hidden valleys, water sources known only to Apache shamans. And then what? We spend the rest of our lives as fugitives. We spend the rest of our lives as free people. Together." The word hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither had dared to voice before. Together. Not just as allies in a desperate war, but as something more, something that transcended the boundaries of race and culture and the bitter history that divided their peoples. "Aiyana," he began. "I know it's impossible," she said quickly. "A white man and an Apache woman in a world that hates us both for different reasons. But impossible things happen sometimes. Look around you. 6 months ago, did you think you'd be sitting in the ruins of a Spanish mission planning war against your own government?" "No," he admitted. 6 months ago, I thought the world was simpler than it is. The world is exactly as simple as we choose to make it. Two people who care about each other, who want to build something together. Everything else is just politics, and prejudice. Before he could respond, the debate around them suddenly quieted. Running Eagle was rising, his face grave with the weight of decision. "The council has reached consensus," the chief announced. "We will accept Captain Reynolds's terms with modifications." Gideon felt his stomach drop. "What modifications?" "Apache bands will cease attacks on railroad construction along designated routes. We will accept federal recognition of our territorial claims. We will cooperate with government authorities in maintaining peace." Running Eagle paused. "But we will not surrender you to territorial justice." "Chief, if you refuse that condition." "We do not refuse. We modify." The old man's eyes held depths of wisdom, accumulated over decades of dealing with white bureaucrats. "You will be tried for your alleged crimes, but under Apache law in Apache courts with Apache judges." Reynolds's voice cut through the night air like a cavalry saber. "That's unacceptable. Nash is an American citizen accused of crimes against the United States government. Mr. Nash chose to become a citizen of Apache lands when he took up arms in defense of our people." Running Eagle replied calmly. "Apache law grants citizenship to any person, regardless of birth, who spills blood for the protection of Apache territory. You can't simply declare jurisdiction over American citizens." "Can we not? Your own government recognizes our sovereignty over designated lands. Surely that sovereignty includes the right to try crimes committed within our borders." Gideon watched this legal chess match with fascination and growing dread. Running Eagle was using white man's law against white man's purposes, turning government recognition of Apache territorial rights into a shield that might protect him from territorial justice. But shields could be broken, and he doubted Reynolds would accept such Byzantine reasoning. "This is ridiculous," the captain snapped. "I'm not going to stand here and debate legal technicalities with the duly recognized leaders of a sovereign Apache nation." Running Eagle's voice remained perfectly calm. "How unfortunate. I had hoped American officers were trained in diplomatic protocol." The insult hit its mark. Reynolds straightened his face, flushing with anger and frustration. Around the fires, Apache warriors watched this verbal duel with the same intensity they might have shown during armed combat. "Fine," Reynolds said through gritted teeth. "I'll relay your modifications to territorial authorities, but don't expect Washington to accept them. We expect Washington to honor its own laws and treaties, nothing more, nothing less." As Reynolds stalked back toward his cavalry lines, Aiyana leaned close to Gideon's ear. "That won't hold them for long. Legal technicalities buy time, not freedom." "How much time?" "Days, maybe a week, long enough for territorial lawyers to find some precedent that overrules Apache jurisdiction, long enough for Crow Dog to track us wherever we go." The Apache Council was breaking up now, with chiefs returning to their warriors to explain the night's decisions. Some looked satisfied with the compromise they'd negotiated. Others appeared troubled by the legal complexities they'd introduced. All of them understood that the morning would bring new challenges, regardless of how the federal government responded to their modified terms. "We should leave," Aiyana said quietly. "Tonight, before Reynolds decides that cavalry law trumps Apache sovereignty. And go where Mexico initially. There are Apache bands south of the border who've never submitted to American authority. From there," she shrugged, "north to Canada maybe, or west to California where no one knows our faces." Gideon looked around the ruined mission at the Apache warriors preparing for an uncertain dawn, at the chief who had risked everything to protect him from territorial justice. "I can't just abandon them. They don't need you anymore. The newspaper campaign has given them political leverage they never had before. The government wants peace more than it wants your head, otherwise Reynolds would never have come here alone to negotiate. But if I run now, it undermines everything they've gained, makes them look like they're harboring fugitives breaking faith with federal authorities. Better that than having you hang from a territorial gallows while they watch helplessly." They were interrupted by the approach of a young Apache warrior, one of Running Eagle's personal guards. "The chief requests your presence," he said formally. "Both of you." They found Running Eagle sitting alone beside the mission's ancient well, his weathered hands tracing patterns in the dust. In the starlight, he looked like a figure from legend, the last free Apache chief, negotiating the terms of his people's survival with enemies who outnumbered him 1,000 to 1. "Sit," he said without looking up. "We must speak of difficult things." They settled themselves on either side of the well, close enough to speak quietly without being overheard by sentries or sleeping warriors. "You know this legal stratagem will not protect you for long," Running Eagle said to Gideon. "American lawyers will find ways around Apache jurisdiction. They always do. I know. And you know that Aiyana counsels flight. She believes you can escape to places beyond the reach of cavalry and bounty hunters." "Yes. What do you believe?" Gideon stared down into the dark water at the bottom of the well, seeing his own reflection fragmented by ripples. "I believe that running solves the immediate problem but creates new ones. Aiyana and I become fugitives living in constant fear of capture. You become vulnerable to accusations that Apache leaders harbor criminals and break faith with federal authorities. And if I stay and submit to territorial justice, I probably hang. But the legal precedent stands. Apache sovereignty means something. Apache law has jurisdiction over Apache lands. That might matter for future cases, future negotiations." Running Eagle nodded slowly. "You think like a lawyer mapmaker, but lawyers rarely die for their legal theories. Some things are worth dying for, and some people are worth living for." The chief's eyes shifted to Aiyana. "Love is not a luxury warriors can afford, but it is sometimes the only thing that makes warfare worthwhile." "Grandfather," Aiyana said quietly, "you cannot ask him to choose between duty and love. The choice will destroy him either way. I ask nothing, but I observe that choices made from duty alone often serve no one, while choices made from love sometimes serve everyone." Before either of them could respond, the sound of galloping horses echoed across the desert. A single rider moving fast but not in panic, a messenger then bringing news that couldn't wait for dawn. The rider who emerged from the darkness was one of Gray Fox's scouts, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with urgency. He dismounted at a run and strode directly to where Running Eagle sat. "Chief," he said in rapid Apache, then switched to English when he saw Gideon and Aiyana. "Crow Dog is coming, 2 hours behind me, maybe less. 50 men well armed moving fast." "How did he find us?" Aiyana demanded. "Someone talked. Someone always talks when there's gold involved." The scout's expression grew darker. "But that's not the worst news. Continue. Crow Dog isn't alone. He's riding with a federal marshal, 2 territorial judges, and a company of cavalry from Fort Bowie. They have papers, arrest warrants, extradition orders, legal authority to take the mapmaker by force." Gideon felt the walls closing in. Reynolds's diplomatic mission had been a delaying tactic, buying time for legal authorities to assemble the paperwork necessary to override any claims of Apache jurisdiction. By dawn, this place would be crawling with federal agents armed with the full authority of American law. "How long do we have?" Running Eagle asked. "Less than 2 hours, maybe 90 minutes if they're moving cautiously." The chief rose, his mind already shifting from negotiation to tactics. "Wake the warriors, prepare for immediate departure. Cache any supplies we cannot carry, destroy anything that might aid our enemies. And the mapmaker." Running Eagle looked at Gideon and Aiyana, his expression unreadable. "That decision belongs to them." As the Apache camp erupted into controlled chaos, warriors loading essential supplies, scouts preparing alternate escape routes, sentries watching for signs of approaching enemies, Gideon and Aiyana found themselves facing the choice they'd been avoiding all night. "We have to go," she said, "right now before Crow Dog arrives with his federal marshals and his legal papers. Go where they'll track us wherever we run." Not if we separate from the main group. Let Running Eagle take his warriors north toward the Chiricahua strongholds, while we head south into Mexico. Split their pursuit, make them choose which targets to follow. You're asking me to abandon the Apache cause just when they need support most. I'm asking you to stay alive. Dead martyrs don't help anyone. Around them, the mission ruins were emptying as Apache fighters melted into the desert like ghosts. Some headed north toward traditional strongholds in the mountains. Others scattered east and west, following routes that would confuse any pursuit. Within minutes, the place would be deserted, except for stone walls and cold ashes. Aiyana, Gideon said quietly, if we run now, we'll spend the rest of our lives running. There will always be another bounty hunter, another federal marshal, another legal complication. The only way to end this is to face it. Face it how? By letting them hang you in Tucson while crowds cheer, by making sure the whole world watches, by turning a simple execution into a statement about justice, about the rights of indigenous peoples, about the cost of American expansion. He took her hands in his, feeling the calluses from years of weapon handling, the strength that could break men's bones or tend wounded children with equal skill. The newspaper campaign worked because it told a story people wanted to hear. My trial could tell the same story on a bigger stage. Your death, you mean? My choice. The first truly free choice I've made since this all began. She pulled her hands away, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You're asking me to watch them kill you. I'm asking you to help me make sure it matters. Document everything, send reports to every newspaper from San Francisco to New York. Make sure they can't hide the truth in some territorial courthouse where no one's watching. Gideon, I love you, he said simply. I've loved you since that first day when you saved my life in the desert. But love isn't just about what we want for ourselves, it's about what we're willing to sacrifice for each other. Don't you dare make this about sacrifice. Don't you dare turn this into some noble gesture that makes it easier for you to die. Then don't make it about dying. Make it about living you, living your people, living your children's children, living in a world where Apache rights mean something because one white man was willing to stand up for them. The sound of hoofbeats was growing closer now, echoing off canyon walls as Crow Dog's mixed force approached the mission. Federal marshals with legal papers, territorial judges with hanging orders, cavalry troopers with rifles and sabers. The full weight of American law and American power converging on a pile of ruined stones where two people who shouldn't love each other tried to choose between duty and desire. There's no time, Aiyana said desperately. We have to decide now. Gideon looked toward the approaching dust cloud, then back at the woman who had become his whole world in the space of a few impossible weeks. The choice wasn't really about duty versus love. It was about which kind of love mattered more. Love for one person or love for the idea that justice might someday triumph over power. Go, he said. Find Running Eagle, help him lead the people to safety. Document everything that happens here. Make sure the world knows. I won't leave you. You have to. Someone needs to tell this story, and I can't do it from a territorial jail cell. Then we both go, right now, while there's still time. No. His voice carried finality. This is where it ends, where I stop running and start standing for something. She stared at him for a long moment, her face cycling through anger and despair and something that might have been pride. Then she leaned forward and kissed him a kiss that tasted of desert wind and starlight and the salt of tears she refused to shed. If you die for this, she whispered against his lips, I will never forgive you. If I live through this, he whispered back, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. She pulled away, checked her weapons one final time, and turned toward the horses where Running Eagle's warriors were making their final preparations. But she paused at the edge of the firelight, looking back at him across the ruins of the mission. Gideon, yes. When they write the newspaper stories about this night, make sure they spell my name right. Then she was gone, disappearing into the desert darkness, like the warrior woman of legend she had always been. Gideon stood alone among the ruins, listening to the approaching thunder of hoofbeats and watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. In the distance, dust clouds marked the final scattering of Apache war parties as they dispersed into country that existed on no white man's map. By dawn, this place would be crawling with federal agents and territorial officials, but they would find only stone walls and cold ashes. And one mapmaker who had finally learned the difference between surveying the world and changing it. The first riders appeared on the horizon as the eastern sky began to pale with the promise of dawn. Crow Dog in the lead, his scarred face visible even at distance. Behind him, the blue uniforms of cavalry troopers and the dark suits of federal marshals. Men with papers and guns and the absolute certainty that American law trumped Apache justice. Gideon Nash sat down beside the mission well, pulled out his surveyor's notebook and began to write his final map, not of territory to be conquered, but of a choice that might, if he was very lucky, help change the world. The pen scratched across paper as dawn light crept over the mission walls, Gideon's final words taking shape in the surveyor's notebook that had charted so many miles of contested territory. Behind him, the thunder of approaching horses grew louder. Crow Dog's mixed force of bounty hunters, federal marshals, and cavalry troopers riding hard toward their rendezvous with territorial justice. I, Gideon Nash, being of sound mind and facing certain death, do hereby testify to the following truths, he wrote in steady handwriting. The Apache people have been systematically betrayed by a government that views them as obstacles to progress rather than human beings with legitimate claims to their ancestral lands. The railroad companies have corrupted territorial officials, purchased false surveys, and deliberately violated treaty obligations in pursuit of corporate profits. I have seen children tortured for information, sacred sites desecrated for convenience, and warriors forced to choose between starvation and violence. The sound of hoofbeats was very close now. Gideon folded the completed testimony carefully and tucked it inside his shirt, next to the railroad maps that had started this whole impossible journey. Whatever happened in the next few hours, someone would find those papers. Someone would read his words and understand why a white man had chosen to die for Apache freedom. Crow Dog appeared first, his massive frame silhouetted against the rising sun as he guided his horse through gaps in the mission walls. The scarred Apache's eyes swept the empty ruins, taking in the cold ashes of abandoned fires and the absence of the 100 warriors who had gathered here just hours before. Too late, he said in accented English, his voice carrying bitter disappointment. They scatter like rabbits. Not all of them, called a new voice from behind him. Federal Marshal William Crane rode into the ruined chapel with the confidence of a man backed by the full authority of the United States government. Tall and lean, with the kind of mustache favored by territorial officials, he carried himself like someone who had never doubted the righteousness of American law. Behind him came the cavalry troopers from Fort Bowie, their weapons ready but their faces showing the uncertainty of soldiers who'd been chasing ghosts for months. Mr. Gideon Nash, I presume, Marshal Crane said, dismounting with careful precision. You're a difficult man to find. I've been right here, Gideon replied, rising slowly from beside the well. Waiting for you. How refreshingly honest. Most fugitives don't make appointments for their own arrest. Crane produced a folded document from his coat pocket. Federal warrant for your arrest on charges of treason, sedition, conspiracy against the United States government and violation of territorial law regarding commerce with hostile Indians. Impressive list. Did I miss anything? Murder of federal agents, destruction of government property, incitement to rebellion. The marshal's smile was thin as a knife blade. Territorial Judge Morrison was quite thorough in preparing the charges. Gideon looked around the empty mission, noting how the cavalry had positioned themselves to block every possible escape route. Professional work. Captain Reynolds had trained his men well. but there was something almost anticlimactic about the whole scene. After months of running battles and desperate escapes, his capture felt oddly peaceful. "Where are the others?" Crow Dog demanded, his scarred face flushed with frustrated rage. "The woman, the chiefs, the warriors, gone," Gideon said simply. "Scattered to places you'll never find them." "We'll see about that." Crow Dog raised his voice, addressing the cavalry troopers. "Search every canyon, every cave, every hiding place within 50 miles. They cannot have gone far." "Actually, they can," Marshal Crane said mildly. "Apache war parties have been disappearing into this desert for centuries, but that's not our primary concern." He gestured to two of the troopers. "Sergeant Williams, place Mr. Nash under arrest. Use irons. I'm told he's surprisingly resourceful." As iron shackles closed around his wrists, Gideon felt an unexpected sense of relief. The running was over. The constant fear of capture, the weight of decisions that affected hundreds of lives, the terrible responsibility of choosing between love and duty, all of that was finished now. Whatever came next, at least, it would be simple. "You realize this arrest will accomplish nothing," he said, as the sergeant checked his bonds. "The Apache bands are already beyond your reach. The newspaper campaign has turned public opinion against the railroad. Even if you hang me tomorrow, the larger fight continues." "Perhaps," Marshal Crane replied, "but sometimes the law isn't about winning larger fights. Sometimes it's about ensuring that crimes have consequences." They loaded him onto a spare horse and began the long ride back to Tucson, where territorial justice waited in the form of Judge Morrison's court. The journey took 2 days through country that Gideon now knew better than any surveyor in Arizona Territory, hidden springs where Apache families had camped for generations, sacred sites where warriors received their adult names, canyons that echoed with the ghosts of ancient peoples. As they rode, he found himself thinking about Aiyana. Had she reached Running Eagle's retreat safely? Were the scattered Apache bands regrouping in the Sierra Madre Mountains, or had some been caught by cavalry patrols? Most importantly, was she following his final request to document everything that happened? The newspaper campaign had been their greatest weapon, more effective than rifles or dynamite in changing public perception of the Apache resistance. On the second day, they encountered evidence that the campaign was still working. A group of Eastern journalists had taken the stagecoach to Tucson specifically to cover Gideon's trial, drawn by newspaper reports of the renegade surveyor who had turned against his own government. Marshal Crane tried to refuse their requests for interviews, but civilian law trumped military authority when it came to press access. "Mr. Nash," called a reporter from the Chicago Tribune as they made camp for the night, "is it true that you personally planned the Apache raids on railroad construction sites?" "I provided intelligence that Apache leaders used to defend their territorial rights," Gideon replied carefully, "just as Army scouts provide intelligence for cavalry operations against Indian settlements. But you're a white man, educated in Eastern schools, employed by an American railroad company. Why betray your own people for a lost cause?" Gideon considered the question while evening shadows lengthened across the desert. "Because I stopped seeing it as a question of white people versus Indian people and started seeing it as a question of right versus wrong. The Apache weren't fighting to destroy American civilization, they were fighting to preserve their own. Some people would call that treason. Some people called the Boston Tea Party treason too. History decides which rebellions become revolutions." The reporter scribbled notes by firelight, while Marshal Crane watched with obvious displeasure. But the federal marshal understood the political realities as well as anyone. Public opinion mattered, especially when Congress was debating appropriations for Western territorial administration. "Mr. Nash," another journalist called out, "what about the Apache woman known as Aiyana? Reports describe her as your companion during the resistance campaign." "Miss Aiyana is the most remarkable person I've ever known. Gideon replied without hesitation. Warrior, strategist, linguist, diplomat. If she'd been born white and male, Eastern newspapers would be calling her the next George Washington. Instead, they call her a savage. They call her that because acknowledging her intelligence and courage would force them to reconsider everything they believe about Apache people. It's easier to dismiss her as a savage than to admit she's fighting for the same principles that founded this country. That exchange made headlines in papers from San Francisco to Boston, with editorial writers debating whether Indian resistance could be equated with American revolutionary principles. Conservative newspapers condemned such comparisons as treasonous nonsense, while liberal publications began questioning the moral foundations of Western expansion policy. They reached Tucson on a Thursday morning, riding through streets lined with curious onlookers who had come to see the famous renegade surveyor. Some faces showed hostility: railroad workers who blamed him for construction delays, territorial officials who saw him as a threat to established order, but others displayed sympathy or even admiration, especially among the Mexican residents who had their own complicated relationship with American territorial authority. The territorial courthouse was an imposing adobe structure designed to project the authority of federal law in a region where such authority often seemed theoretical. Judge Morrison presided from a bench carved from black walnut, shipped at enormous expense from Missouri, wearing robes that looked absurdly formal in the desert heat. "Mr. Nash," the judge said as Gideon was led into the courtroom, "you stand accused of serious crimes against the territorial government of Arizona. How do you plead?" "Not guilty by reason of moral necessity," Gideon replied, drawing murmurs from the packed gallery. Judge Morrison frowned. "That's not a recognized plea under territorial law." "Then I plead not guilty and request the right to present a defense based on the principles of natural law and constitutional protection for indigenous rights. This court recognizes only territorial statutes and federal precedent, Mr. Nash. Your political opinions are not relevant to the legal charges against you." "With respect, Your Honor, my political opinions are the only thing relevant to these charges. The government alleges I committed treason by opposing railroad construction through Apache lands. I contend that the real treason lies in violating treaties, destroying sacred sites, and making war on women and children." The trial that followed lasted 3 days and attracted national attention. Eastern newspapers sent their best correspondents to cover the proceedings, while telegraph operators worked around the clock to transmit developments to editorial offices across the country. The prosecution presented evidence of Gideon's involvement in Apache raids, his correspondence with newspaper editors, his detailed knowledge of railroad vulnerabilities. But the defense, led by a young lawyer named Samuel Richardson, who had volunteered his services, turned the trial into an indictment of government Indian policy. Witness after witness testified about broken treaties, violated agreements, and the systematic destruction of Apache culture. Mexican settlers described raids by white vigilantes who killed Apache families and sold children into slavery. Former soldiers recounted orders to burn Apache food stores and poison water sources. The most dramatic moment came when Aiyana herself appeared in the courtroom. She entered during the 3rd day of testimony, walking through the gallery with the fluid grace that had made her legendary throughout the Southwest. Conversation stopped, heads turned, and even Judge Morrison seemed momentarily speechless at the sight of the warrior woman who had become the face of Apache resistance. "Your Honor," Samuel Richardson said, rising quickly, "the defense calls Miss Aiyana as a witness." "Objection," the prosecutor snapped. "This woman is a fugitive wanted by territorial authorities. She should be arrested, not called as a witness." "Miss Aiyana has been granted safe passage under federal law regarding testimony in capital cases," Richardson replied smoothly. "Marshal Crane can confirm the documentation." Judge Morrison looked confused and irritated, clearly unprepared for this development. "Approach the bench," he ordered both lawyers. As the legal team huddled in whispered conference, Aiyana took her place in the witness chair with calm dignity. She wore traditional Apache clothing, buckskin dress, decorated with turquoise and silver, but also carried the bearing of someone equally comfortable in Harvard lecture halls or Washington drawing rooms. "State your name for the record," the clerk said nervously. "Aiyana, daughter of wind in the mountains, granddaughter of she who speaks to thunder, warrior of the Chiricahua Apache Nation." "And your relationship to the defendant?" "Gideon Nash is my partner in war, my companion in exile, and the man I have chosen to love, despite all the reasons such love should be impossible." The words rang through the packed courtroom like a bell, causing another stir among the spectators. Here was the legendary Apache warrior woman speaking of love with the same directness she might use to describe battle tactics. "Miss Aiyana," Richardson began when the judge finally allowed testimony to proceed, "please describe your first encounter with Mr. Nash." "I found him bleeding in the desert, abandoned by his own people, about to be killed by raiders who wanted to sell his maps to the highest bidder. I could have left him to die. Most Apache would have given what his maps represented. Instead, I chose to save his life." "Why?" "Because he tried to help me when he had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Because he asked questions instead of making assumptions. Because he saw me as a person rather than a savage." "What was your impression of his character during the months you spent together?" Aiyana's eyes found Gideon's across the courtroom, and for a moment the legal proceedings seemed to fade into irrelevance. "He is the most honorable man I have ever known. White or Apache, it makes no difference. He chose justice over profit, principle over safety, love over loyalty to his own people." "Did he ever express regret for his actions?" "Only once. He regretted that we could not save more Apache lives, protect more sacred places, prevent more suffering. He regretted that doing the right thing required betraying the people who raised him." The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal, focusing on the raids, the destroyed railroad property, the disruption of territorial commerce. But Aiyana answered every question with calm precision, never denying the facts while consistently reframing them in terms of Apache self-defense and territorial sovereignty. "Miss Aiyana," the prosecutor said finally, "do you understand that your testimony makes you an accessory to the crimes with which Mr. Nash is charged? I understand that your law considers love a crime when it crosses the boundaries your people have drawn around their hearts," she replied. "I understand that courage becomes treason when it serves the wrong cause. I understand that justice becomes terrorism when the victims are inconvenient." "That's not what I asked." "Yes, I understand the legal consequences of my testimony. I also understand that some truths are worth dying for." After Aiyana's testimony, the prosecution's case seemed to lose momentum. Public opinion, already shifting due to the newspaper coverage, turned decisively in favor of the defendant. Telegrams poured in from supporters across the country demanding clemency or presidential pardon. Eastern politicians began asking uncomfortable questions about territorial administration and Indian policy. But Judge Morrison remained unmoved by public pressure. His instructions to the jury were clear and uncompromising regardless of their personal sympathies. They must decide the case based on territorial law, not popular opinion or political considerations. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in protests and cheers, depending on which side of the territorial divide spectators occupied. Judge Morrison called for order, then proceeded to sentencing without delay. "Mr. Nash, you have been found guilty of treason against the territorial government of Arizona. The penalty prescribed by law is death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn on Friday, October 13th. The judge's voice carried no emotion. "Do you have any final words for this court?" Gideon rose slowly, his shackles clanking in the sudden silence. Every eye in the packed courtroom was fixed on him. Reporters ready to record his final statement, territorial officials waiting to see if he would beg for mercy, Apache sympathizers hoping for words that might inspire future resistance. "Your Honor," he said in a clear voice that carried to the back of the gallery, "you are about to hang a man for loving justice, more than gold, for choosing conscience over conformity, for standing with the oppressed against the oppressor. If that is treason under territorial law, then territorial law itself is treasonous to the principles that founded this nation." He turned to face the spectators, his eyes finding Aiyana in the crowd. "I regret nothing except that I will not live to see the day when Apache children can grow up free in their ancestral lands, when treaties become sacred agreements rather than convenient lies, when love transcends the artificial boundaries that divide human beings into categories of us and them. But that day will come, not because of my death, but because of the choices made by people like the woman who saved my life in the desert, who taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else matters more than fear. The railroad may complete its southern route, the Apache may be forced onto reservations, the territorial government may hang me at dawn, but the story we have written together will outlive us all." He sat down to thunderous applause from half the courtroom and angry shouts from the other half. Judge Morrison gavelled for order, but the demonstration continued for several minutes before marshals could restore quiet. That evening in his cell in the territorial jail, Gideon received a stream of visitors, newspaper correspondents seeking final interviews, local ministers offering spiritual comfort, a representative from the governor's office hinting at possible commutation if he would publicly recant his statements about territorial Indian policy. But the visitor he most wanted to see came just after midnight, when the jail had grown quiet, except for the sound of guards walking their rounds. "Hello, mapmaker?" Aiyana's voice came from the shadows outside his cell window, soft as desert wind. She had somehow bypassed the guards, scaled the jail's outer wall, and positioned herself where they could speak without being overheard. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "If they catch you, let them try." Her face appeared at the barred window, illuminated by starlight. "I had to see you one more time. I thought you were heading for Mexico with Running Eagle's band." "I was. But some things matter more than safety." She reached through the bars to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that weeks of worry had carved around his eyes. "I've been documenting everything just as you asked. The trial, the testimony, the public reaction. Newspaper editors from New York to San Francisco are calling for federal investigation of territorial administration." "Good. That's what matters." "No, what matters is that I love you, and they're going to kill you at dawn, and there's nothing I can do to stop it." For the first time since his arrest, Gideon felt his composure crack. Facing death in the abstract was one thing, looking into the eyes of the woman he loved and accepting that they would never have the life together they'd dreamed of was something else entirely. "Aiyana," he said quietly, "if you remember nothing else about this night, remember that meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me. You saved my life in more ways than one. Don't talk like this is ending. We still have time. I could get you out of here. I know where the guards are positioned, how to reach the horses. No, we've talked about this. Running solves nothing, and dying solves everything. Maybe, if the story reaches the right people, if the public pressure builds enough momentum, if the sacrifice means something." He shrugged. "At least it's a choice I can make freely." They talked through the remaining hours of darkness, sharing memories of their impossible journey together. The first time she'd saved his life in the desert, the night they'd planned railroad raids by firelight in hidden canyons, the morning when he'd realized that love could transcend every barrier that history and prejudice had built between their peoples. As dawn approached, she prepared to leave. "Aiyana," he called softly as she started to climb back down the jail's outer wall. "Yes." When you tell this story, and you will tell it, won't you make sure people understand that it wasn't about one white man becoming Apache or one Apache woman loving a white man? It was about two human beings choosing each other despite all the reasons they shouldn't. I'll tell it, she promised. I'll tell it until the whole world knows. And Aiyana? Yes. Touch me there, he said, placing his hand over his heart. One more time. She reached through the bars and placed her palm over his heart, feeling the steady rhythm that would soon be stilled forever. I'll love you until my last breath, she whispered, and I'll love you beyond mine. Then she was gone, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness like the warrior woman of legend she had always been. Gideon sat back on his narrow cot and waited for the sunrise that would bring territorial justice to the man who had dared to love across the boundaries of race and nation. The hanging took place at dawn in the courthouse square, witnessed by hundreds of spectators who had gathered from across the territory. Newspaper correspondents sent telegraph dispatches to editorial offices throughout the nation, ensuring that Gideon Nash's final moments would be recorded for history. He walked to the gallows with steady steps, his head high, showing no sign of the fear that any reasonable man would feel facing such a death. The territorial officials who had orchestrated his capture and trial watched from a platform draped with American flags, their faces grim with the satisfaction of legal duty fulfilled. But in the crowd, other faces told different stories. Mexican settlers who saw in his death an echo of their own struggles against territorial authority. Eastern visitors who had come west expecting to find simple stories of civilization triumphing over savagery, only to discover moral complexities that challenged everything they believed. And scattered throughout the gathering, individuals whose dark eyes and weathered faces suggested Apache heritage, though they had come dressed as Mexican laborers or peaceful reservation Indians. "Mr. Nash," the territorial chaplain said as they positioned the noose, "do you wish to make a final statement?" Gideon looked out over the assembled crowd, his eyes searching for one face among hundreds. He didn't find her Aiyana was too smart to risk capture by appearing at his execution, but somehow he felt her presence anyway. "I die for loving justice more than gold," he said in a voice that carried across the square. "For choosing conscience over conformity, for believing that Apache children deserve the same future as white children. If that makes me a traitor to territorial law, then I die proudly in the company of all the other traitors who chose right over might." The trapdoor opened at exactly sunrise, and Gideon Nash fell into history. But the story didn't end with his death. Within hours, telegraph lines carried news of the execution to newspapers across the nation, sparking editorial debates that would continue for months. The Chicago Tribune ran a front-page story titled "Martyrdom in the Desert," while the New York Herald published a searing indictment of territorial Indian policy. Eastern politicians began demanding congressional investigations into Arizona administration, and railroad investors grew increasingly nervous about projects in Indian territory. Most importantly, the Apache resistance continued. Led by Running Eagle and inspired by the memory of the white mapmaker who had died for their cause, Apache bands launched a series of coordinated attacks that brought railroad construction to a complete halt. But these new raids followed different rules: no civilian casualties, no destruction of non-military targets, and always accompanied by written statements explaining Apache grievances to Eastern newspapers. Aiyana herself became the voice of this new resistance, sending eloquent letters to editorial offices throughout the nation that told the story of her people's struggle in language that educated Eastern readers could understand and appreciate. She wrote about sacred sites destroyed by railroad construction, about children sold into slavery by corrupt Indian agents, about the man who had loved her enough to die for her people's freedom. The letters were published from Boston to San Francisco, creating a flood of public sympathy that forced federal authorities to reconsider their Arizona policies. Within 6 months of Gideon's execution, Congress had ordered a complete investigation of territorial administration, replaced corrupt officials, and begun negotiations for a new treaty that would guarantee Apache rights to designated lands. The railroad was eventually completed, but along routes that respected Apache territorial claims and sacred sites. Construction crews worked under federal protection and Apache oversight, with tribal representatives monitoring every mile of track to ensure treaty compliance. Years later, when historians wrote about the Apache Wars and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, they would note that the turning point came not in any military battle, but in the love between a white surveyor and an Apache warrior woman who dared to believe that justice could triumph over power. Aiyana lived to see many of those changes, becoming in her later years a respected advocate for indigenous rights and a bridge between Apache and white communities. She never married, never forgot the man who had chosen her people's freedom over his own life, and never stopped telling the story of how love had changed the course of history. On quiet evenings, sitting by fires in the mountains that Running Eagle's diplomacy had secured for Apache families, she would speak to the children about the map maker who had learned to chart territories of the heart, about choices that transcended race and nation, about the day when a white man had asked an Apache woman to touch him there in the place where courage and love made their home together. And in those stories, Gideon Nash lived forever.